disappeared, murdered and missing, solved and unsolved cases. Chapter 1. Disappearance of J.C. Dugard. At age 11, J.C. Dugard was playing outside of her home in South Lake Tahoe, California, when her captors kidnapped her on the 10th of June 1991. Philip Garrido was a convicted rapist who continually raped J.C. and even impregnated her twice. She gave birth to her two daughters at the ages of 14 and 17. J.C. was living in the backyard shack at the home of Garrido and his wife Nancy. A police investigation was prompted at the home, and that's where they discovered, after 18 years, J.C. Dugard. The Garridos were arrested, meaning J.C. was free and reunited with her mother, Terry Probin, on August 26, 2009. J.C. Lee Dugard was born on May 3, 1980, and had grew up in the community of South Lake Tahoe, California, her whole life. On June 10, 1991, when J.C. Dugard was just 11 years old, she was kidnapped outside of her home. Carl Probin was J.C.'s stepfather, saw the abduction through his home's garage window and attempted to chase the car down whilst on his bicycle, but was outrun. Local authorities were immediately informed of the kidnap and were aided by the FBI in their search for J.C. During the search, dogs, aircrafts and hundreds of law enforcement personnel were used, but to no avail. Even with all these helpful resources, J.C. still wasn't found, but with many years to come, she would eventually be found living with Philip and Nancy Garrido, 170 miles away in Antioch, California. Convicted rapist Philip Garrido and his wife Nancy Garrido had J.C. locked in a makeshift recording studio by her captors in the backyard of their home. They had renamed her Alyssa to cover her identity, and that's when J.C. soon realised the major motive for her abduction. She was raped repeatedly by Garrido, which resulted her getting pregnant twice. At age 14, J.C. gave birth to her first child, which was a girl, and 3 years later, at age 17, she gave birth to a second girl. The names of the two daughters are unknown, as they want their identity to be secret. During the time, she wrote a journal frequently which documented a lot of her feelings unloved, lonely, fearful and depressive. This was due to her contact with the outside world, which was largely prohibited. J.C. constantly thought about her family members and wondered if they were actually searching for her. The victim grew to cherish any human interaction, even from her kidnappers. After all these years of lies and manipulation about her family's lack of love for her, J.C. didn't know how to leave. Even though she denied having Stockholm Syndrome, people believe she had developed it over the years. Stockholm Syndrome is where hostages start to develop a psychological alliance with their captors as a survival strategy during captivity. On August 24, 2009, Philip Garrido visited the UC Berkeley campus with the two daughters to inquire about holding a religious event. The UCPD Special Events Manager thought his behaviour was suspicious, so he had an officer conduct a background check, in which this revealed that Garrido was on parole for kidnapping and rape and was a registered sex offender. When they followed up his parole officer, he was surprised that he had children. 2 days later, on August 26th, Garrido attended a meeting with Nancy, J.C. and their daughters with the parole officer. Garrido insisted that J.C. and the young girls were relatives, and J.C., who called herself Alyssa, initially covered for him, but later on he broke down, revealing all his crimes and confessing to the kidnap of J.C. Shortly after, Philip and Nancy Garrido were charged with 29 felony counts, including rape and false imprisonment. On August 26, 2009, more than 18 years after she was abducted, J.C. Dugard was reunited with her mother, Terry Probin, in South Lake Tahoe, California. Family learned that they would be rewarded $20 million for the state of California due to the failed parole supervision, which could have possibly prevented it going on for as long as it did. J.C. Dugard published a book named A Stolen Life in July 2011, which was about what happened over the years spent with the Garridos. In July 2016, Dugard published a follow-up on her book entitled Freedom, My Book of Firsts, in which it describes her experiences after years of captivity. Chapter 2. Ted Bundy's Murder Case. In the spring and summer of 1974, women at colleges across Washington and Oregon were disappearing at an alarming rate. The police in the Pacific Northwest was in panic, but law enforcement had a few ideas on who was behind it. In just 6 months, 6 women had been abducted. When the first 2 abductions happened of Janice Ann Ott and Denise Mary Naslund, the panic was spread across the state, as even ones in broad daylight on a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park were missing. On the day of Ott and Naslund's disappearance, several other women remembered a man who tried and failed to lure them into his car. Authorities were enlightened about an attractive young man who had his arm in a sling and drove a brown Volkswagen Beetle. When this description was released to the media, 4 people identified the man, whose name was Ted Bundy. When the tips were rolling in about Ted Bundy, the police inundated them and dismissed him as a suspect. The reasoning behind their decision was that he was a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record, which meant he didn't fit the right profile. Born in Vermont, his mother, who had disappointed his grandparents, had an out-of-wedlock pregnancy with his father, who was unknown. His grandparents raised him as their own child and made him believe his mother was his sister. It wasn't until later on in his life that he learned that the woman he believed to be his sister was actually his mother. Ted and his mother would regularly get beat by the grandfather, which caused them to run away to Tacoma, Washington. Ted Bundy was later adopted by Johnny Bundy, who had married his mother and gave him his last name. Though Bundy described himself as a loner who would stalk the seedy streets at night to spy on women, many who remember Bundy from high school described him as a reasonably well-known and well-liked. In 1965, Ted Bundy graduated from high school, then enrolled in the University of Puget Sound for the first year, but later on transferred to the University of Washington to study Chinese. He then re-enrolled as a psychology major in 1988. Then, in January of 1974, the first attack occurred. Even though it wasn't an actual murder, he still had assaulted an 18-year-old who was a student and a dancer at the University of Washington. Bundy had broken into the girl's apartment and bludgeoned her unconscious and sexually abused her. The assault left her in a 10-day coma and with permanent disabilities. Ted Bundy's next victim was Linda Ann Healy, who was also a University of Washington student. Just like the previous assault, Bundy broke into Healy's apartment in the early hours and knocked her unconscious. He continued to clothe her body and carry her to his car. She was never seen again, but parts of her were later discovered where Bundy had dumped all bodies of his victims. Bundy continued targeting female students in the area and had even developed a technique for approaching women. He would wear a cast to make him look vulnerable and ask for help. He would then bludgeon them unconscious before raping and killing them. Over the next 5 months, Bundy abducted and murdered 5 female college students in the Pacific Northwest: Linda Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberto Parks, Brenda Ball, and Georgian Hawkins. Responding to these countless disappearances, a major investigation was called. One of the services that helped with the investigation was Washington State Department of Emergency Services, and unfortunately, this is where Bundy worked. As the manhunt for the abductor continued, Bundy was accepted to the law school in Utah and moved to Salt Lake City. Even though witnesses' descriptions matched perfectly to Ted Bundy and his car, this still would have made it harder for the police to investigate, as he had moved out of that estate. But whilst living in Utah, he still continued to rape and murder young women. However, someone who was previously part of Bundy's life was aware that he had relocated to the area, and when hearing of the murders taking place in Utah, she then notified the police her suspicion that Bundy was behind the killings. There was an extravagant amount of evidence which proved Bundy was behind all of this. Finally, in August 1975, Bundy was pulled over and police discovered masks, handcuffs and blunt objects in the car. Even though this wasn't enough to arrest him, a police officer put him under surveillance. Investigating further into the suspect, police found his previous car, which was a Beetle, and discovered his hair matching 3 of his victims. He was convicted of kidnapping and assault and sent to prison while police attempted to build a murder case against him. The arrest didn't stop Bundy from killing. He had been allowed into the library during a break in his preliminary hearing and would normally research the laws pertaining to his case. However, this time he was unshackled, and when he saw the chance to escape, he took it. He had jumped through a window on the 2nd floor and ran for it. He made his way towards Aspen Mountain using a car he had stolen, as it would add more distance between himself and the jail cell he was fleeing. But his reckless speed didn't go unnoticed, and police officers spotted him. He was recaptured after 6 days of being on the run. Bundy's next escape took place just 6 months later. As he carefully studied the prison map, he soon realised that his cell was directly beneath the living quarters of the prison's chief jailer. Another inmate had a small hacksaw that he would use to scrape away layer after layer of plaster. Unlike the last time, he had planned ahead and had stored a small amount of money that was smuggled by Carol Ann Boone, the woman he would later marry him in prison. This money would be used to help him get away from the prison. When he was finally ready, he crawled through the hole into the chief jailer's room and then found a man's civilian piece of clothing. He then dressed in that and strolled out of the jail's front doors. He immediately stole a car and started to make his way to Florida. Bundy struggled to keep a low profile as he was unable to work, as he was unable to produce identification. He was back then to stealing money. On January 15, 1978, 2 weeks after his escape, Bundy broke into a Chi Omega sorority house on the Florida State University campus. In just 15 minutes, he was able to sexually assault and kill 2 students. He then broke into an apartment which lived several blocks away and beat a woman so badly that she lost her hearing permanently. Still, on the run, February 8th, he continued to abduct and murder a 12-year-old girl from her middle school. Once again, due to his reckless driving, he had caught the attention of the police. When they realised that the plates on the car belonged to a stolen car, they proceeded to pull him over and also found the IDs of the 3 dead women in his vehicle. Throughout his trial, Bundy ignored the advice from his lawyers and ended up taking charge of his own defence, which later leads him to sabotaging himself. Bundy was convicted and was given death row at Florida's Rayford prison. He suffered abuse from other prisoners and even conceived a child with Carol Ann Boone, who was his wife that he'd married whilst he was on trial. On January 24, 1989, he was finally executed by the electric chair, where hundreds of people gathered outside the courthouse to celebrate his death. Even though he had confessed to many murders, the exact amount still remains unknown. Ultimately, authorities thought of him as one of the most infamous and terrifying serial killers in American history, as he has killed about 30 to 40 women. Chapter 3. Madeleine McCann Missing Case. Madeleine McCann was a 3-year-old toddler who was born on the 12th of May 2003 in Leicester, England. On May 3, 2007, her family went on a holiday to Portugal with no clue what was about to happen. When the parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, went out for dinner during the evening with other parents, Madeleine had gone missing. During the investigation, her parents were considered suspects, but have since been cleared. Private investigators were used as well as the Portuguese. In 2011, they received even more assistance by Scotland. The 10th anniversary of her disappearance passed in May 2017, and her case is still one of the most famous missing person cases in the UK and in Portugal. Approaching the end of the family holiday in Portugal, Kate and Jerry had left their 3-year-old Maddie and her 2-year-old twin siblings unattended in their rented apartment at the resort Praia da Luz. They were on holiday with 7 other friends which also had kids, meaning there were 8 children in total. They began their dining at around 8:30 and the restaurant they were in was about 180 feet away from the apartment complex. However, the apartment was not gated and was accessible to the public. Each parent took turns checking on their children throughout the night, and it was around 10 p.m. that Kate McCann discovered Madeleine was missing. Surprisingly, the Portuguese police believed the McCanns were responsible for the disappearance of their daughter. A theory was created that Madeleine had accidentally died in the apartment due to a sleeping pill overdose, and the McCanns had gotten rid of her body. In September 2007, Kate and Jerry McCann were labelled suspects, but was later lifted due to lack of evidence. When the Portuguese chief resigned in 2008, he shortly thereafter released a book, The Truth of the Lie, which became a bestseller. In it, he alleges that Madeleine accidentally died in the apartment, and in the attempt to cover it up, her parents faked her abduction. In 2009, Kate and Jerry McCann sued Amaral for libel and later won. January 2018, the British and Portuguese authorities were reportedly pursuing a person of interest and have become a critical line of inquiry. The investigation has now reached the country Bulgaria, where authorities are searching for a woman in purple they want to bring in for questioning. The British Metropolitan Police believe that Madeleine was stolen during a burglary or by child sex traffickers. A former police chief has requested that Madeleine's parents, Kate and Jerry, as well as their friends who were dining with them that night, to be interviewed again, since they've never been questioned by British authorities. Ever since Madeleine's disappearance, there has been over 8,000 sightings of her, with the investigation reaching close to a controversial £12 million. In March 2019, Netflix released an 8-part documentary called The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann. The series revisits the early investigations which focus on the parents as likely perpetrators of the crime. It also covered how the British authorities were labelled perpetrators due to their lack of questions to the list of 38 viable suspects who had never been questioned. Despite appearing throughout the documentary via old video clips and media footage, the parents did not participate in its production.